It was a Tuesday morning in November when my daughter called me from a parking lot in Oakville, and I knew from the first second of silence before she spoke that something had finally broken. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Burlington, looking out at the greenbelt behind the house, the one I'd been looking at for 31 years. My coffee had gone cold. My granddaughter Lily was at school. The phone buzzed and I picked it up and heard my daughter breathing. Just breathing, the way people do when they've run out of the energy to cry. "Dad." That was all she said. But I had known for 2 years that something like this was coming. I just didn't know it would be a Tuesday. I didn't know she'd be sitting in a parking lot outside a medical clinic because her husband's mother had called the clinic and told them my daughter was mentally unstable and not to be trusted with her own child's medical decisions. I didn't know she'd have a garbage bag of her own clothes in the back seat because, while she was at that appointment, the locks on the house had been changed. I said, "Where is Lily?" She said, "At school, I can't pick her up." He took my name off the emergency contact list. "His mother is listed first now." I said, "I'll pick her up. You drive to me." Then I put down the phone and sat for exactly 30 seconds, staring at the frost on the back fence. Then I made 3 calls. The first was to the school. The second was to my lawyer. The third was to a man named Dave Keller, who had been my operations manager at Keller Whitmore Logistics for 22 years before I sold the company, and who still owed me a very large favor. Then I got in the truck and drove to pick up my granddaughter. Lily was 7 years old, and she was standing outside the office in her pink winter coat with her backpack on, holding a drawing she'd made in art class. It was a house with a sun and 2 stick figures, one tall and one small. When she saw my truck, she ran. She climbed up into the passenger seat and buckled herself in with the kind of focused seriousness only a 7-year-old can manage. And then she looked at me and said, "Grandpa, did something happen?" I said, "We're going on an adventure. Just you and me and your mom tonight." She considered this very carefully. She said, "Is it a good adventure or a bad adventure?" I said, "By the end, it'll be a good one. I promise." She nodded and held her drawing against her chest and looked out the window at the gray November sky. She trusted me. Children that age trust completely or not at all. And the weight of that trust settled into my chest and hardened into something I want you to understand was not anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous than anger. It was certainty. My daughter was waiting in my driveway when we pulled in. She'd stopped crying. She looked hollowed out, the way a person looks when something they believed in for a long time finally shows them its true face. Lily ran to her mother, and my daughter held her tight and looked at me over the top of her daughter's head and said nothing. Nothing needed to be said. I put the kettle on, and I let my daughter sit at the same kitchen table where she'd done homework as a teenager, and I let her talk. It took 2 hours. I learned things I had suspected and things I had not. I learned that the financial control had started 18 months into the marriage. Quietly, the way these things always start, with suggestions. Her husband suggesting she didn't need her own account because it was simpler to share. Suggesting she leave her job at the design firm because it was stressful and she deserved to rest. Suggesting she didn't need to speak to me so often because it was healthy for a couple to have their own space. His name was Garrett. Garrett Ashford. He was 41 years old, and he was a senior partner at a commercial real estate firm in downtown Toronto, and he had a mother named Patricia who wore silk blouses to Sunday dinners and corrected my daughter's grammar at the table and referred to our family as the Whitmore side of things in a tone that contained an entire library of meaning. I had watched this for 3 years. I had sat at their dining room table in Oakville, eaten their food, listened to Patricia explain the difference between old Toronto families and people who had simply done well for themselves. I had watched my daughter's posture change over those 3 years, the way a person gradually learns to take up less space. I had said nothing, because my daughter had asked me not to. She was trying. She wanted her marriage to work. She needed to know I respected that. I had said nothing, but I had watched everything, and I had made certain preparations. What my daughter didn't know, what Garrett Ashford had never known, was that the commercial property on King Street West, where his firm had its offices, the one his mother Patricia referred to at dinner as our building, had been purchased 14 months ago through a numbered company registered in Alberta. The numbered company was called 1847932 Alberta Limited. There was nothing particularly notable about that name. There was nothing notable about the company at all, except that I owned it entirely. I had bought it through a broker my daughter had never met, using proceeds from the sale of Keller Whitmore Logistics, which I had built from a single refrigerated truck in 1993 into a regional logistics operation with 41 vehicles and contracts with 3 major grocery chains. When I sold it 4 years ago, I received enough money to retire comfortably and to make certain investments I considered worthwhile. The building on King Street West was one of those investments. The Ashford's firm had been tenants for 9 years. They paid market rent. They had never known who the landlord was. Garrett Ashford had fired my daughter from her own marriage on a Tuesday morning and changed the locks on her house while she sat in a parking lot, and he had done this without knowing that his firm's entire operation sat on ground I controlled. But that was not the most important thing I needed to deal with first. The most important thing was Lily. My lawyer, a woman named Sandra Park, who I had worked with for 15 years, called me back at 7 that evening while Lily was asleep in the guest room. Sandra had reviewed what my daughter had told her and was already preparing documents. The change to the school emergency contact list, the removal of my daughter from the joint account, the text messages my daughter had saved over 2 years, showing a pattern of financial control and isolation, all of it was being organized and time-stamped. "There's more," I said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. She said, "Tell me." I told her about the call to the medical clinic. I told her about the garbage bag of clothes. I told her about something my daughter had mentioned, almost in passing, a detail she'd said with exhaustion rather than alarm, that Patricia had begun taking Lily to appointments without telling my daughter, dental and eye appointments, building a paper trail of involvement that my daughter hadn't known to object to at the time. Sandra was quiet for longer this time. Then she said, "I'm going to need everything, all of it. Can you come in tomorrow morning?" I said, 8 o'clock. Lily woke up that night at 2 in the morning and padded down the hall in her socks to find me sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea. She climbed up into the chair across from me and put her chin in her hands and looked at me with her mother's eyes. She said, "Are you worried about Mom?" I said, "I'm going to fix it, Bug." She said, "That's what you said in the parking lot." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you actually know how to fix it?" I said, "Yes, I actually do." She seemed satisfied with that. She asked for a glass of water and I got it for her and she went back to bed. I sat there until 4 in the morning thinking about the next 48 hours. My daughter had not asked me to do what I was about to do. She had asked me to help her with Lily and to come with her to Sandra's office and to be her father. She didn't know about the building. She didn't know about the other things I had quietly put in place over the previous 14 months. The audit request I had filed with the firm's provincial licensing body through an anonymous complaint, citing irregularities I had documented from the firm's publicly available filings. She didn't know about the conversation I'd had with Dave Keller, who in his retirement sat on the board of the Commercial Tenants Association for the King Street corridor and knew every property manager in the downtown core. She didn't know any of it. I hadn't told her because she'd asked me to let her handle her marriage. I had kept my promise. That promise ended in a parking lot in Oakville. The next 72 hours moved the way decisive things always move, in long stretches of waiting followed by short moments of complete irreversibility. Sandra filed for an emergency custody variation order on Wednesday morning, citing the school contact removal and the medical appointment interference. The judge granted a temporary order by Wednesday afternoon. My daughter was back on the emergency contact list by 3 o'clock. Lily went back to school on Thursday, not knowing that a quiet war had been decided in a courtroom while she was doing multiplication tables. On Thursday evening, Dave Keller called me. He said, "I pulled the firm's tenancy file. They're 3 months behind on rent. Their current lease is up for renewal in February." I said, "I know. I've been watching it." He said, "The numbered company's property manager has been patient." I said, "The numbered company's property manager works for me." There was a pause. Then Dave said, "Jim, what exactly have you been building over there?" I said, "Exactly what needs to be built." On Friday morning, I drove to the King Street office myself. I parked across the street and sat for a moment looking at the building. It was a solid 1970s commercial property, 8 floors, brick and glass, nothing glamorous but entirely practical. The Ashford firm occupied the 4th and 5th floors. I had walked past it 100 times without going in. I had watched the lobby from the coffee shop across the street. I had observed without being observed. That morning I walked in. I went to the management office on the main floor and introduced myself to the property manager, a young man named Carlos who knew exactly who I was, and I told him I wanted to deliver the lease renewal notice personally. Carlos looked at the envelope in my hand and then at me and said, "Mr. Whitmore, are you sure you want to do it this way?" I said, "Is Mr. Ashford in his office?" Carlos said, "His car is in the garage." I said, "Then yes." I took the elevator to the 4th floor. The reception area was all polished concrete and curated plants, the aesthetic of a firm that wanted to communicate both substance and modernity. The receptionist looked up and I gave her my name and asked to see Garrett Ashford. She said he was in a meeting. I said I'd wait. I sat down in one of their Barcelona chairs and I waited for 14 minutes. Then Garrett came out. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the particular expression of a man who has just been told an unexpected visitor is his father-in-law. Not alarm. Something more calculated than alarm. Assessment. He said, "Jim, this is a surprise." I said, "I imagine it is." He said, "I don't really have time today. It's a busy—" I said, "I'm not here as your father-in-law." He stopped. I said, "I'm here as your landlord." I handed him the envelope. "That's your lease renewal terms. The rent is going up 32%. That brings it to market rate for the corridor. You've been on a below-market legacy lease for 9 years. It ends in February." He stared at the envelope. He looked at me. He said, "What?" I said, "You're also currently in arrears 3 months. That's $87,000 outstanding. The notice period for arrears under your lease agreement is 15 days. That notice period begins today." The blood had left his face. Around us I could feel the receptionist and the associate who'd followed Garrett out both going very still. I said, "I'd also suggest you have your licensing counsel review the complaint filed with the Real Estate Council of Ontario 6 weeks ago regarding the Brampton transaction. I believe you received that notice. I believe you did not take it seriously." His mouth opened. He said, "That complaint is, how do you know about—" I said, "I know about everything, Garrett. That's the difference between us. You thought you knew what you were dealing with. You were looking at a retired logistics guy from Burlington who was easy to manage at Sunday dinner. You were not looking carefully enough." I turned to leave. Then I stopped and looked back. I said, "My daughter will be at Sandra Park's office Monday morning. Whatever position you take in that proceeding, understand that you are taking it as a man whose firm is in arrears, facing a 32% rent increase, and under active regulatory review. Your mother can correct all the grammar she likes. It won't change the arithmetic." I walked out through the lobby and back across King Street to my truck. I sat in the truck for a moment. I didn't feel triumph. I felt the particular exhaustion of doing something that should not have been necessary. Then I drove to pick up Lily from school. That evening my daughter and I sat on the back deck after Lily was in bed, even though it was November and cold enough to see our breath. She had a wool blanket, and I had my old Roots jacket, and we sat there with decaf and looked at the greenbelt. She said, "What did you do?" I said, "What needed doing?" She said, "Dad." I said, "I bought his building 14 months ago. He didn't know. His firm is behind on rent. Their lease is up in February. I went and told him this morning." She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "You've known this whole time." I said, "I suspected where things were going. I wanted to be ready." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you asked me not to interfere. You were trying. I respected that. I kept my word until the moment it stopped being your marriage and started being about Lily." She pulled the blanket tighter. She said, "He's going to fight everything." I said, "He can fight whatever he likes. He's going to fight it from a weakened position." She said, "His mother is going to make this as ugly as she can." I said, "Patricia Ashford can make it as ugly as she wants. Ugly doesn't change facts." My daughter looked at the dark trees at the edge of the yard. After a while she said, "I feel stupid for not seeing it sooner." I said, "You were not stupid. You were a person who believed in her marriage. That's not stupidity. That's love. He used it against you. That's on him, not on you." She didn't say anything to that, but she didn't argue with it either. What happened over the following 3 weeks I want to be honest about, because I think people sometimes tell these stories as if they were clean and simple, as if justice arrives in a single moment, and everything resolves neatly. It wasn't like that. Garrett hired a family lawyer and came at the custody matter hard. His initial position was that my daughter was emotionally unstable, and he filed an affidavit that I believe he had been preparing for some time, citing incidents, inflating them, framing her exhaustion and distress as evidence of instability. His mother filed a supporting affidavit. It was thorough and it was ugly and it was designed to make my daughter doubt herself. Sandra had anticipated this. The financial control documentation was extensive. The isolation pattern was documented. The school contact removal was dated. The medical clinic call was traced and logged. But what mattered most was something I had asked Dave Keller to help me find 4 months earlier, before I knew it would matter this much. when I was simply watching and preparing. Dave had connected me with a woman named Yolanda Wright, who worked in the financial crimes unit of a private forensic accounting firm. I had retained Yolanda to review the Ashford firm's publicly available filings and cross-reference them against property transaction records in the GTA. What Yolanda found she delivered to me in a report on a Thursday morning. I drove to Sandra's office and put the report on her desk. She read it for 20 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "Jim, this needs to go to the RCMP." I said, "I know. That's why I'm here." The report documented a pattern of transactions over 2 years in which properties purchased through the Ashford firm had been registered at values significantly below the actual purchase price, with the difference moving through a series of numbered corporations before landing in accounts controlled by entities associated with Garrett and his 2 senior partners. It was not sophisticated. It was simply counting on no one looking carefully enough. I had looked carefully enough. The RCMP referral was made through Sandra's office the following Monday. It was quiet, and it was procedural, and it attracted no immediate attention. But 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, the Ashford firm's website went dark. The next morning, their office number rang to a voicemail that said the line was temporarily unavailable. By Friday afternoon, the story was in the Toronto Star's business section, 2 paragraphs citing sources familiar with an ongoing financial investigation into a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in the King Street corridor. No names yet, but the address was identifiable to anyone who knew the neighborhood. I heard about the Toronto Star item from Dave Keller, who texted me at 6 a.m. Friday. I was already awake, standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching the greenbelt. November had given way to December, and there was frost on the grass, and Lily was upstairs asleep, and my daughter was asleep in the guest room, the same room she'd slept in at 16, and for a moment the years collapsed, and I was aware of having lived a long time and of still being here, which is not nothing. My daughter came downstairs at 7. She saw my expression and said, "What happened?" I told her about the Star item. I showed her Dave's text. I watched her read it twice. She said, "Is this because of what you gave Sandra?" I said, "It's because of what he did. I just made sure someone was looking at it." She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands, not crying, just processing. After a moment she looked up and said, "His mother's going to blame me for this." I said, "His mother can believe whatever she needs to believe." She said, "She'll say I put you up to it." I said, "What actually happened is that her son abused a legal process and defrauded clients and believed no one would notice because he was confident. That's not your fault, and it's not my fault." She said, I know that. I said, "I know." We sat with that for a while. Lily came downstairs at 7:30 in her pajamas and her socks, and climbed into the chair beside me and stole a corner of my toast, and announced that she had dreamed about a horse that could speak French. My daughter looked at her daughter, and something in her face changed, the fear and the exhaustion opening briefly to make room for something else. She laughed, a real one, and said, "What was the horse saying?" Lily said, "Very polite things. It said bonjour and merci, and it offered me a croissant." I said, "A bilingual horse. Very Canadian." Lily considered this with great seriousness. She said, "Maybe it was from Quebec." My daughter laughed again, longer this time, and Lily looked pleased with herself and reached for another corner of my toast, and I sat there at the same kitchen table I'd sat at for 31 years and thought about how much of what matters cannot be measured in any way that shows up on a balance sheet. The custody matter concluded in February. The terms reflected what the evidence reflected. My daughter had primary residence of Lily. Garrett had scheduled access. Patricia Ashford's involvement in medical and educational decisions was formally removed. Sandra told me afterward it was one of the cleaner outcomes she had seen given the initial positions filed. The firm's licensing matter was still active as of February, the RCMP investigation ongoing, a matter I had no part in beyond the referral. That process would take its own time. I had handed it to the appropriate people and stepped back. That was correct. That was how it should work. What I want to tell you about instead is a Saturday in March. My daughter had moved into a rental in Burlington, a good one, close enough that Lily could walk to school, close enough that I could drop off groceries and stay for dinner without it being a production. The custody schedule had settled into its rhythm. Lily had adjusted with the resilience that children have when the adults around them are honest with them and steady. That Saturday, she came to spend the afternoon with me. She wanted to bake. She had developed a very strong opinion about shortbread and wanted to test a specific ratio of butter that she had determined by research which at age 7 meant she had watched 3 YouTube videos and written the numbers on a piece of paper in her careful printing. We spent 2 hours making shortbread. It was good. We ate too much of it sitting at the kitchen table, and Lily explained to me at length about a conflict at school involving the assignment of parts in the class play, a matter she had strong views about, and I listened with complete attention because when your granddaughter is explaining the politics of a grade 2 production of Anansi the Spider, you pay attention. At one point she stopped mid-sentence and looked at me very directly and said, "Grandpa, did you fix it?" I said, "Did I fix what?" She said, "The thing, the hard thing, from before." I said, "Yes, Bug, it's fixed." She looked at me for another moment, assessing, the way she does. Then she nodded and went back to her shortbread. That nod, that small, trusting nod. I have thought about it many times since then. I want to say something I mean carefully. I am not telling you this story to make myself the hero of it. I was not the hero of it. My daughter was. She is the one who gathered those text messages over 2 years, quietly, without telling anyone, because some part of her knew. She is the one who sat in a parking lot and called me instead of collapsing entirely. She is the one who walked into Sandra's office and told the truth clearly and completely, which is harder than it sounds when the person you're telling the truth about is someone you loved. I did what fathers do. I paid attention. I prepared. I was ready when ready was needed. But I want to be honest about something else. I spent 28 years building Keller Whitmore Logistics, and I was not always present the way a father should be present. I missed school concerts. I missed weekends. I told myself it was for the family, for the future, for security. And some of that was true. And some of it was the easier explanation for a man who is more comfortable in his operations than in the harder work of being there in the ordinary way. I cannot get those years back. I know that. My daughter knows that, and she has been more generous about it than I deserve. What I can do is be present now. I can be the grandfather who shows up. I can be the father who picks up the phone in the parking lot and says, "Drive to me." I can make shortbread on a Saturday and listen to the grade 2 politics of the school play and be exactly where I am, instead of already somewhere else in my mind. There's a line I read somewhere once, in a book someone gave me after my wife died 8 years ago, and I have thought about it often. The most important time is always now, and the most important person is always the one in front of you. I don't know if that's wisdom or just the truth arriving late, the way truth often does. But I know that the most important moment of everything I've described to you was not standing in an office on King Street handing over a lease notice. It was not sitting in Sandra Park's office watching the case come together. It was not the Saturday morning when Dave Keller texted me the Toronto Star item and I stood at my kitchen window and felt the particular cold satisfaction of something long prepared finally arriving. The most important moment was a 7-year-old girl in a pink winter coat running toward my truck in a school parking lot. Everything else was in service of that. Everything else was just the work. If you've been sitting with me through this, through the parking lot and the kitchen table and the King Street office and the February courtroom and the March shortbread, then I hope you'll tell me something. If this were your child, your grandchild, would you have waited the way I waited? Would you have made the same preparations? I want to know I am not alone in this. And if you are in the middle of something like this right now, if you are the person sitting in the parking lot or the person watching helplessly from a distance, I want to say this directly. Pay attention. Keep records. Find Sandra Park in whatever city you're in, and do not mistake patience for passivity. The people who counted on others not looking carefully enough have always been wrong about one thing. Eventually, someone looks. Welcome to our channel. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this kind of story today, share it with them. We'll be back next week with another story about the things that are worth going to the wall for. This story contains dramatized and fictional elements created for narrative purposes. The characters, events, and specific details are imagined, but the patterns at the heart of it, financial control, isolation, the abuse of institutional processes, and the importance of documentation and legal support, are drawn from real human experience. If you or someone you know is navigating a situation like this, please reach out to a family law professional and remember that in Canada, organizations like Luke's Place and the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic exist to help. You are not as alone as it feels right now.